So the next section is going to be on postflop leaks, obviously. And there's quite a few postflop leaks that are pretty common throughout the player pool of PLO 25. But the biggest mistakes that I see from most players are along these subjects. And the first one is bet sizing. I could go into a whole tons of video series on this topic, but because this is a quickie and we have limited time, I can only go over a few different things. So the first thing that comes to mind is that a lot of players are going to make either a 65% pot or maybe a slightly bigger. They really don't consider the whole bet sizing spectrum, as Matthew John put it. And I really liked how he said that, in that there's just so many different things you can do with your bet sizing. You can bet 1/3 pot to maybe induce some action from a player. So again, just like pre-flop, it shouldn't just be a formula where you have a value bet and so you bet 65% normally. That's your standard bet size. That's complete bullshit. You should have a reason for why you're betting and how wide you want their calling range to be when you have a value bet, and how wide or how narrow you want their calling range to be when you have a bluff. And normally you want that narrow, obviously. So there's a lot we can talk about there, but those are the biggest points. In that, just be aware of that you're making sure that your bet sizing is exactly what you want it to be based on what you want to accomplish. The second thing is the gap between the flop c-bet and turn c-bet. And so many players have this leak, I would say, and this is basically where a player has a 70% c-bet on the flop percentage, and then the turn they have about half or even a third of that at 20 to 40%. And it's just really easy to exploit because the person who realizes this actually really does not need a hand to beat them. Whereas if you're betting the flop a high percent, say 70% again, but if you're betting the turn 55 to 60%, while that's just as easy to exploit, you kind of need a hand to do it unless you're really comfortable check raising with air on the flop or turn. And so that gets a little more dicey, whereas if you're not c-betting on the turn, it's a lot easier to exploit and you really don't need a hand. As well as it's the easiest way to exploit people for having really wide flop calling ranges. And this is pretty much common throughout any stake that you're going to get to in PLO, that people can call the flop pretty wide, and then of course loose passive players will call very wide with like any flush draw, any pair, any gut shot, things like that. And we really need to take advantage of that wide calling range by betting the turn. And then the second to last point is not value betting thinly enough on the river. This is definitely a humongous leak I see a lot of players have, and I'm sometimes guilty of it myself. And it's just really not getting value in the river. Someone phrased it really well when he said that, everyone pays attention in the flop and turn, but really the river's the most important street out of all of them because there's so much money at risk. And if we're constantly missing, like 10 to 20 big blinds of value, if we're not value betting, or even more depending on the situation, we're just missing a ton of value to our win rate, and just really easy value, because people usually play extremely straightforward on the river, and I can't remember the last time I've ever seen a check raise on the river at these stakes that was actually a bluff.